Welcome to Preparing for Successful Submission of the Cancer Center Support Group Clinical Protocol and Data Management Review. My name is Ellen McLaughlin, and I'll be moderating today's session. We have a large group on the line with a lot of great material to present, so let's get started and look at the agenda. First, we'll do some introductions and share some administrative processes for today's session. We'll then talk about the core requirements for your CPDM, followed by the steps involved with preparation for a successful site visit and other helpful tips. Before moving on to a Q&A session, we'll have the opportunity to hear firsthand from Dr. Sylvia ONeil and Matt Huser from Thomas Jefferson University's Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center, who recently went through this process with a successful outcome, and they will talk about lessons learned. We'll plan to leave enough time for us to answer your questions before we close the session. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and I'm happy to introduce our speakers. Many of you know Anita Harrison, who brings a wealth of information to our team from her experiences as AD for administration at many cancer centers, her work in clinical trials research, and her leadership in organizations such as CCAF. Terry Matson, who has also worked with many of today's participants, similarly brings extensive clinical research knowledge, having served as Administrative Director for MUSC's CTO. She has served as Interim CTO Director for several emerging cancer centers, implementing successful CPDM systems. Anita and Terry, thank you both for joining us today. A few housekeeping notes. During the course of the presentation, please feel free to ask questions using Zoom's chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Each of you will receive an electronic copy of today's webinar within a week or so. The webinar will also be available on Huron's website. A few facts about our audience today. As you can see, we have a great blend of NCI-designated centers and aspirational centers. It is also interesting to note that almost 40% of the respondents were not aware of the CPDM rating for their center. As you'll hear today, following the NCI summary statement is a critical step in preparation for a successful submission, and we hope that during today's session you'll become familiar with resources available to you in achieving that goal. The information presented today is based on our interpretation of the CCSG FOA as outlined in PAR 17095. Here we provide a summary of frequent terms and acronyms relevant to the CPDM, and you'll hear more about those today. Most importantly, we have several resources available to you. The Office of Cancer Centers website is an excellent resource. Here you find the CCSG FOA, DSMP examples, and data table guides. The current list of NIH-approved peer-reviewed funding organizations will be helpful in developing your metrics. And as you'll hear shortly, your Cancer Center administration is one of your most important resources, and ongoing communications with them will be invaluable to achieving a successful outcome. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and I'll pass the mic over to Anita Harrison.
Thank you, Ellen. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with what we mean when we speak of the Clinical Protocol and Data Management, or CPDM section or services, this is the component referred to in the Cancer Center Support Grant Guidelines, requesting applicants to describe certain shared services provided by the center, all relating to supporting and reporting clinical research within your center. These services are typically provided by an office within the center, most commonly referred to as the Clinical Trials Office, or the Clinical Research Office, or perhaps the Clinical Research Services. Centers use a variety of names, and you will likely hear me interchange CPDM with CTO or Clinical Trials Office, but I'm referring to the same entity. There are several written components within the CCSG application where the center's services and processes for clinical research are described. As a faculty or staff leader in clinical research, it is important to understand what these components are and how the typical NCI-designated cancer center organizes these components in relationship with one another and who is accountable for these components. As shown in this figure, most all NCI-designated cancer centers have a senior leader within their center that holds a title similar to Associate Director of Clinical Research, or Associate Director of Clinical Science, or perhaps Associate Director of Clinical Investigations. This senior leader typically reports to the center director and often receives advice from a senior level clinical research leadership committee. Again, this committee can have a variety of names, but is typically comprised of the faculty leaders of the CTO, chairs of the Protocol Review Committee, and Data Safety and Monitoring Committee, as well as other key stakeholders in the clinical research enterprise within your center. The Associate Director of Clinical Research is typically directly responsible for the quality and efficient functions of the CPDM Services or Clinical Trials Office. The Protocol Review and Monitoring System, which is typically comprised of the clinical working groups or your center may call them disease focus groups or site modality groups, and a protocol or scientific review committee. The third component under the purview of the Associate Director for Clinical Research may be the Data and Safety Monitoring System. Again, this is a common structure, but may vary to some degree. Today's webinar is going to zero in on the CPDM component. Future Huron webinars will be focused on these other components. The CCSG guidelines articulate several expected services for the CTO or CPDM component. These include providing central management and oversight functions for coordinating, facilitating, and reporting on cancer-relevant clinical studies for the institutions that define the center. As a clinical research faculty or staff leader, it is important to have clarity as to what institutions are being included in your CCSG application. Your center may have many clinical or clinical research affiliations with other centers, but they may or may not be included in the CCSG, and this will impact how you report your accruals. There are well-defined criteria for the eligibility of an institution to be included in the CCSG. These are typically called consortium members or partners, and making sure you understand this before you start compiling your application is fundamental. These are conversations that need to take place with the center's director if it is unclear as to which institutions are being included in the application. A second expectation is that your CTO serve as the central location of all protocols and maintain a centralized database of study and patient-specific information, typically in a clinical trials management system like Encore or Velos. The CTO will be expected to provide many data tables in the grant application, including accrual reports on the inclusion of minority, women, and children in clinical research, as well as a required report known as Data Table 4, which is a comprehensive listing of all prospective, hypothesis-driven, cancer-related studies within your center. The CTO is expected to provide or at least ensure that there are quality control functions in place for staff compliance monitoring and trial auditing, notably for all investigator-initiated studies within the center. This may be done by the CTO or by another office within your institution. The CTO is expected to provide onboarding and ongoing education and training services for clinical research support staff throughout the center's enterprise. The CTO facilitates the submission of study data to the NCI Clinical Trials Reporting Program, which is a requirement for all NCI-designated cancer centers. And finally, the CTO typically supports the functions of the PRMS and DSMC administratively, but it's critical to understand that the PRMS and DSMC have distinct functions from the CTO. Most of these criteria are outlined in the CCSG funding opportunity announcement. Note that there is not a requirement that a center CTO provides centralized protocol execution services, such as screening, enrolling, and coordinating protocol parameters for specific studies. These services can be organized in a hub and spoke type model with varying management accountability structures within the center. However, most highly rated CTOs do centralize these functions as well, but again, it is not a requirement of the CCSG. Now I'm going to discuss the details for organizing the written CPDM component in your new or renewal CCSG application. If you have been tasked with developing this section, these are the elements of the written section that you need to be familiar with. First, there are required attachments for the CPDM component. Second, there's a budget and budget justification for the CPDM. There's an abstract document and a separate specific aims document. Finally, there's a research strategy document. I'm going to focus on the top 4 items, and my colleague, Terry Matson, will then discuss the elements of the research strategy. However, I will point out that the research strategy section not only includes the write-up for the CPDM, but also includes a summary of the DSMC, as well as a description of the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research and inclusion of children in clinical research. These 4 sections are reviewed separately by the reviewers and scored and or approved or disapproved separately. Regarding the first required attachment for the CPDM written component, the center is asked to provide accrual information for all interventional studies with the option of reporting non-interventional accrual. These are reflected in tables 1 and 3. Based on CCSG reviewer expectations, we highly recommend also including table 2, accrual to interventional treatment studies, which is a subset of table 1, as this tends to be a focus of many CCSG reviewers. We believe it is better to provide interventional treatment accruals up front with transparency rather than wait to be asked to present these data at your site visit. As I referenced earlier, these accruals should only reflect that activity within the institution or institutions included in your CCSG application. You can highlight network activities in your CPDM text and/or in a section called the Community Outreach and Engagement section of the application. A second required attachment for the CPDM section is related to the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research. These tables must use the official NIH gender and racial ethnic categories and subcategories. We recommend the following format for presenting this information. As seen in Table 4, gender, ethnicity, and race information is presented for the general population of the center's defined catchment area, the individuals diagnosed with cancer within the defined catchment area, and the newly registered patients within the center. Include an unknown category if you must, but note that reviewers expect the number of unknown entries to be minimal. If your center has option for more than one race, add that to the table rather than listing as unknown. As mentioned earlier by Ellen, make sure you have discussed with the director and the leaders in charge of the Community Outreach and Engagement component to ensure that you are using the same definition of catchment area. Data presented here should match by year and source as what is being presented in the Community and Outreach component. Table 5 provides summary accrual information from the most recent 12-month period for all clinical research studies conducted at the center in each of the following areas: interventional treatment accruals, interventional non-treatment accruals, and non-interventional studies. Again, reviewers expect that gender, race, and ethnicity is being collected on all research subjects, so there should be very limited reports of unknown, especially in the interventional treatment accruals. The data in Tables 4 and 5 should be routinely monitored by the CPDM and with your center leaders. Reviewers will expect to see that accruals reflect the population entering the center and cancer incidence in the catchment area. Strategies to address need to be fully described in the CPDM component in Part 3. The faculty and staff leadership should discuss with the center administration what portion of the CCSG grant will be allocated to CPDM. Then the appropriate individuals can be selected to be included on the budget, and the CTO staff should work with administration to draft the budget justification. Appropriate costs to include on the CCSG budget are listed here. Please note that costs that should not be included are staff associated with the direct coordination of specific studies and data entry, patient care cost, and staff supporting pre- and post-award budget management and coverage analysis. Reviewers often ask the percentage of the center's overall CTO budget that is cost recovered and the percentage that is directly supported by the center or institution. We recommend that you include this type of table at the end of your budget justification. Make sure your leadership knows this information so that they can articulate the answer if questioned. The last two sections of the CPDM component that I wanted to mention was the abstract and specific aims. These are separate documents. The abstract cannot be more than 30 lines and should summarize the information in parts 1 through 4 outlined in the research strategy, or in other words, should touch on the CPDM, DSMC, inclusion of women, minority, and children in research. The specific aims is limited to 1 page and should include aims for all 4 parts of the research strategy. I am now going to turn the presentation over to Terry Matson to walk you through the CPDM research strategy section.
Thank you, Anita. As mentioned, the research strategy component of this section has 4 required parts, which all fall under a 12-page limit. The CCSG guidelines do not define page limits specific to each part, and using these 12 pages wisely is a common challenge faced by all centers. A suggested breakdown of page allocation is to use approximately 8 pages to describe the CPDM, 2 pages to describe the data and safety monitoring component, a page to a page and a half towards inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research, and the last half page addressing the inclusion of children in clinical research. The data that was included in the attachments Anita described earlier in slides 17 through 19 do not count towards this 12-page limit. In the following slides, we will focus on Part 1, CPDM, and details relating to Parts 2, 3, and 4 will be the focus of future webinars. Next. The typical content in CPDM is outlined in the CCSG guidelines. However, that's providing high-level guidance on what information should be included. Centers often wrestle with how best to organize and deliver this content within the 12-page allotment. Over the next few slides, we'll talk through a suggested structure or headings to ensure the required content is included and suggestions for how best to convey the information. With a mixture of both established NCI-designated centers and emerging centers on the call, I want to point out that the organization of Part 1 is largely the same for both emerging and established centers, but there are subtle differences which I will point out as we go. This section often begins with CPDM highlights or achievements over the previous project period for renewing centers, or 3 years for new centers, to demonstrate progress and accomplishments to the reviewer. This is an opportunity for the center to highlight strengths, significant accomplishments, and convey the value added by the CPDM to the center. For NCI-designated centers, these highlights are often followed by an itemized response to the CPDM reviewer critiques that were received following the previous competitive renewal. Site visit reviewers will be provided these critiques, so it is helpful to concisely address what actions were taken in response to the critiques outlined in the previous review. The next area of focus is to characterize the center's clinical research activity. In this section, centers should deliver impactful metrics that reflect their clinical research activity and portfolio. Content would include metrics such as time to activation, a breakdown of studies and accruals by source, category, and purpose. This is an area in which pictures literally are worth 1,000 words. Using graphics to convey positive changes, such as a reduction in time to activation or a positive shift in trial or accruals in alignment with the prioritization schema shown there, is helpful as they break up text and provide reviewers with a visual aid of the center's performance. To put this information in context, a common reviewer expectation is that industry-initiated trials should represent 1/3 or less of the trial portfolio. Although this percentage may vary based on a number of factors within a center, notably one with a robust Phase 1 program. The root of this reviewer expectation is that industry-initiated trial activity should not be the major emphasis of the center's research portfolio. Instead, investigators are encouraged to pursue grants, partner with industry or other sources to develop investigator-initiated studies. This is important as the center must demonstrate that it is a leader in the development of novel new cancer interventions and strategies emanating from the center's research program. Next. Continuing in the Part 1 CPDM section, the next topic would be to address the organization and management structure of the CPDM. This content is helpful to orientate the reviewers, and here again, charts and graphics are very helpful. Within this section, an organizational chart should be included that outlines the functional units of the CPDM, such as regulatory, research finance, clinical operations, training, quality, etc. It is recommended that centers include the employee or FTE count specific to each unit within the organizational chart. Again, this is to help reviewers visualize how the CPDM resources are organized and distributed. Following this organizational chart would be descriptions of each functional unit. It is also important to include in this section a description of the qualifications and responsibilities of the CTO medical director and administrator. A helpful tip, which ties back to slide 20 that Anita presented regarding the CPDM budget and justification, is if funding is requested for CPDM leadership, it is important to verify that the language description included in the budget justification is harmonized with the description of the roles as outlined in this section. Harmonization of content and data across all sections of the grant is essential. Having described the organization and management of the CPDM, it's helpful to then outline the services provided. Services typically provided include regulatory, study activation support, project management for the development and management of investigator-initiated studies, assistance with patient screening, enrollment, and coordination, the provision of quality control, training, and education, and a mechanism to promote communication both internally and externally. It is important to realize that no two centers are the same, and how these services are provided may vary based on institutional resources. Next, we will describe the CPDM environment specific to this physical space in which the CPDM services are housed, as well as IT capabilities supporting these services. When describing the physical space, it's important to not only include the actual footprint of the location of the space, but opportunities created specific to that location. For example, if clinical staff reside in close proximity to the clinical space, that would be worth detailing. Likewise, for the regulatory and/or financial staff, if they reside near central research administration offices, such as the IRB or Grants and Contracts Office, that too is important to highlight. Regarding the IT capabilities of the CPDM, this would include a description of the CTMS in use at the center, perhaps an electronic data capture platform used for IISs, and any other IT solution that may have been implemented and/or developed locally to assist with CPDM functions. Examples might include the adoption of an e-regulatory solution, communication tools or apps that are utilized, or homegrown tools that simply help manage CPDM services. Understanding the IT capabilities educates the reviewers as to how the CPDM carries out its charge. Following the environment, it is helpful to outline a description of high-level policies that govern CPDM activities. Such policies might include standard operating procedures for the institution and center, which include processes for feasibility reviews, managing research billing compliance, just to name a few. As the center will be putting forth these policies as those that govern the activities, it's important that all staff performing these tasks be held to the same standards. Nearing the end of this section, it's important to include how the CPDM supports governance, oversight, strategic planning, and evaluation. It would be in this section that centers will describe relevant leadership committees, including the membership composition that are in place to support the clinical research mission of the center. This section would also be a very good place to highlight how CPDM leadership interface with the center's senior leadership regarding strategic planning, and comment on any CPDM-focused surveys that may have been conducted demonstrating evaluation. Lastly, this section typically closes with future plans that the CPDM is working towards. Future plans presented should reflect plans that will grow and strengthen the CPDM and add value to the center as a whole. Examples might include implementing new systems to improve efficiency and quality of a given process. Next. It is equally as important to understand the review criteria by which this section will be evaluated. 1. Effectiveness of the CPDM in centralizing, managing, and reporting on the trial activity center. Conversations often revolve around the need to have a centralized CPDM. Centers may have a fully centralized model or employ a hub and spoke model. However, the more centralized the center is, the stronger and more efficiently it will function, and that will come across in the written section as well as the site visit. It is important to have unified SOPs governing all activities. 2. How effective are the quality control functions and training services offered by the CPDM? It is essential to demonstrate a robust quality assurance program and training and education curriculum. It may be that some of these services are provided through a central institutional resource, but it should be described as such and demonstrate how CPDM provides oversight of those activities. 3. Does the CPDM identify impediments to accrual and provide remedies? While it's no longer defined in the CCSG guidelines, it remains an unwritten expectation of reviewers to see the equivalent of 10% of all newly diagnosed patients to the center enroll on interventional treatment trials. To this end, demonstrating innovative processes or procedures that are put into place to increase accrual, such as patient navigation for trials, utilizing your electronic medical record to screen patients, and community engagement efforts will strengthen this section. 4. How reasonable is overall accrual based on trials supported? As mentioned earlier, it is important to monitor the portfolio and accrual breakdown to ensure the center is adhering to the prioritization schema. 5. Lastly, how effective is the CPDM in timely initiation and completion of trial activities? It is an unwritten expectation that the average study activation be in the neighborhood of 90 days across all study types. Highly rated centers often fall in the 90 to 130 average day range. Centers can choose to report time to activation data in either mean or median, but you'll want to define that. If your center's time to activation is longer than 130 days, you will want to provide a strategy that will be employed to improve upon this metric. Next. As indicated earlier, parts 2, 3, and 4 of this section will be the focus of future Huron webinars. But it's important to note that part 2, data safety monitoring, would include a summary of the center's approved data safety monitoring plan and the processes used to carry out this charge. Next. Likewise, for parts 3 and 4, women, minorities, and children in clinical research, these sections summarize the data presented in attachments 2A and 2B that Anita mentioned earlier. Of note, the NIH maintains a policy that children are individuals under the age of 21. However, the center may defer to a state definition. It's important to define which definition is being used for the presentation of this data. At this time, I would like to turn the conversation back to my colleague Anita for her perspective on site visit tips.
Your CCSG application will be submitted January 25th, May 25th, or September 25th in a given year. Approximately 4 to 6 months after submission, there will be a site visit where 18 to 22 individuals will be invited to your center to listen to presentations by your leadership and to have in-depth question and answer sessions about each component. In order to prepare for your site visit, you should meet with your center leaders to confirm site visit agenda and time allotments. The CPDM presentation is typically 10 minutes with a 10-minute question and answer session. It is typically presented by the CTO Medical Director or the Associate Director of Clinical Research. The CPDM may also be presented in combination with the PRMS, DSMC, and or with the inclusion of women, minority, and children for an up to a 20-minute block with 20 minutes question and answer. You should plan for a 30-minute breakout session with selected CCSG reviewers to discuss the CPDM, PRMS, and data safety and monitoring in greater detail. You should secure a nearby conference space for this discussion. Centers often include a CTO or CPDM poster at their site visit. You should have available bio sketches for the PRMS, DSMC, and CTO leadership. You should also have available your SOPs for your CTO and supporting materials demonstrating CPDM services. For instance, if you have developed IT solutions, you may want to provide a demonstration, or you may have external communications delivering information about your clinical trials portfolio. Finally, you should have updated clinical research data, including accrual since what was reported in the written application, and you should have an updated data table ready for your CCSG reviewers.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Terry. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sylvia ONeil and Matt Huser from Thomas Jefferson University's Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center. Their cancer center recently went through the CPDM submission process with a successful outcome. Sylvia and Matt, thank you for joining us today. What can you tell us about your experiences?
Hi, thank you for having us. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So under my purview, I have the regulatory, the monitoring and auditing, all the SOPs, education and training, the clinical coordination and data management of all the phases of the clinical trials at the SKCC, CT.gov, the CTRP, CTMS, the Scientific Review Committee, and the DSMC. So what we decided to do was Matt and I decided to prepare about 10 things that we thought really helped us. Our first one was to have the reviewers' previous grant cycle results, reviewing these and know how we were going to address the issues noted by those reviewers. how to address those concerns, obviously earlier in the year, and then start to write the response as soon as possible. The second is to meet with your team, and we mean administrators and the registrars and program leaders, and especially your Cancer Center director. We all created a very strong relationship, and then we're able to easily communicate throughout those, especially that like last year and a half when we were really putting this together before the submission. Number 3 was we created a SharePoint environment or a shared drive folder. You could do either. We really created the SharePoint environment, and this was owned by Matt, and we kept all our documents there. We had very strict version controls of the slide decks and any other document that we were creating for the site visit and the submission of the grant itself. This again was created very early, and as we got closer to the date, people already knew how to save. It was easy for us to communicate, and then we were able to edit on the spot. Excuse me. We had scheduled meetings regularly with the Associate Director of Clinical Research, and we met with him twice a week for that year and a half, and actually we still do. We review all of our current operations in one meeting during the week, and then in the second meeting, we reviewed all the strategy and vision. We reviewed all the questions that we thought we could get and the answers, and we made sure that we were all on the same page of exactly how we were going to be answering those questions. We met regularly also with program leaders. We educated them on the clinical trial process, so there was no questions of what those were. We, they knew exactly what trials were assigned to their programs. We informed them of all the changes. Obviously, Matt and us, we met again twice a month. We reviewed all our questions and answers. We knew all our startup processing, the reporting lines, all our times to activation. We reviewed the biosketch, making sure it was like all on the current template, all on the same font. And then of course we had meetings with the CRO staff, consistently giving them updates and numbers. We prepared a lot with our tour, and we trained them on potential questions and what we expected them to answer, what words specifically to use and what words specifically not to use. We created a playbook which became invaluable. We shared this with our leadership and our staff. We wrote specific numbers that were highlighted throughout the book in order to make sure everybody had the same number of accrual for each year. We knew exactly what time activation everybody was supposed to have. We had our mission in there. We had the CRO's mission. We had every definition we could think of that included our catchment area. We thought of every question that we could think of, every answer. We reviewed those. We had pictures to make things easier. The graphs that we used in the playbook were the same graphs that were used in all the slide decks, and that was from the presentation that the associate director gave to the administrative piece that Matt gave and to the piece that I gave at the site visit. Every single slide deck had the exact same graph, and all the way down to the terminology about using therapeutic. It was not the word we used. We all used treatment. So it was very specific. We designated backups for every section and every table, and 2 people always knew where everything was at any given point. Number 7 was we checked all our technology multiple times. We have electronic dashboards and we have a clinical trial app. So we reviewed those months and months prior, all the way through the day of. We had multiple mock site visits that Matt can talk a little bit more about. And then we had a lot of practice questions and practice answers because we knew that, you know, one word could really open up a can of worms. Matt, do you want to, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I can take it from there, Dr. ONeil. Can everyone hear me okay as well?
Yes.
Okay, so Dr. ONeil, we led by principles. The first principle was connectedness. The clinical research organization, as we refer to it, was connected with administration and oversight of the grant. Their team provided our team as an administrative team an entire overview of the clinical research organization and was always on point. So when your administration and your CRO are talking together and everyone's on the same page, including your program leaders, shared resource directors, it makes the day flow and makes everything go very, very, very easy. The next thing Dr. ONeil talked about was planning. Planning was key. We developed a playbook. We had everything in that playbook and we stuck by the playbook. We were fully prepared. We developed calendars. We held mock site visits. We had 8 practices. And what we did was we also dedicated practices specifically for the CRO, the CPDM, and all those sections. And we really ran through a dry runs with our external advisory board as well as our internal advisory board to make sure everything sounded correctly and basically had one voice. The goal of the grant is to have one voice. Our office had one voice with the clinical research office. So it really came across like we weren't really working on a grant. We do this every day, and it's the norm, which is, you know, what we've developed here with the help of Huron over the last 2.5 years. We really have that connectedness. We have the planning and we have the preparations all in place now, where it's just day-to-day operations seem normal and basically carried over to the day of the site visit. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is flexibility. Now, this is very, very key. We were so prepared. We had everything planned out. We had the room set up. We had everything ready to go the day before our site visit. We get a weather alert that says there's going to be a tropical storm in October in Philadelphia. Probably the first time we ever heard those words. We had 24 hours to turn an entire clinical research organization move it 3 blocks over into a single conference room so that our site review team could review our entire clinical research organization on the fly in the same room so they didn't have to travel in the tropical storm. The reviewers were amazed that we were able to do that in 24 hours. But that's because our team was prepared. We had everything in line. We had a great leadership team, and we were all on the same page. So we can't stress that more than anything.
And that includes the staff. The staff was all hands on deck. Everybody knew exactly what was going to happen. Yeah.
Exactly. One voice, one team. And if you don't have that connectedness now, work on it. We did several things to bond, so think outside the box as well. We went and we threw axes, you know, which is a hipster thing to do here in Philadelphia. We went bowling. We went to happy hours because you really have to have that family type of feel when it comes to submitting a CCSG. You spend nights, you spend weekends, you spend a lot of time away from your family. So if you feel like you're with another family, it's not as bad. Many nights we slept in our offices on the phone until 1, 2 in the morning, including our cancer center director, Dr. Knudsen, to ensure the grant was perfect. And we had a great submission. We had a flawless site visit. So if you guys have any questions, we're more than happy to take them.
Yeah, we'll be here.
Well, thank you both. Clearly, your preparation, organization, and communications were really essential to your success. Thank you for sharing your perspectives and your insight.
Thank you.
With that, that wraps up today's presentation, but we do have some time for some questions and answers. I see we've had a couple related to site activation. And Terry, if you wouldn't mind responding to this. But the question reads, for site activation, the 90 days expectation, what are the time points for this expectation? Start and stop time points to say study is activated at site.
Thanks, Ellen. This is a fantastic question, and I'm sure it's a common question from a lot of the individuals on the call today. So from a CCSG or an NCI perspective, the 90 days, that day 0 is the day that trial is submitted to the protocol review committee or the scientific review committee. And then the date of activation or the end date would be the date that study is open or trial is open for patient enrollment. So from a CCSG perspective, when you report your time to activation, it would be specific to those 2 metrics, being the date a trial is submitted to scientific review and the date that same trial is then open for enrollment. However, it's important to recognize that the activities leading up to the submission to scientific review are equally as important to capture, as that speaks to process opportunities. And so we would encourage and highly recommend all centers to ensure that they're capturing the timelines related to the point when a concept or a study enters the system to the point of scientific review. But from a reporting perspective for CCSG, it would be the date that a study or trial is submitted to the scientific review, and then again open to enrollment.
Thank you, Terry. We've also had several questions about the accruals and benchmarks, in particular the pediatric accruals. Anita, could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Again, there are no written rules about the level of metrics you need to have for accrual. For pediatrics, it is a special and a vulnerable population. There are a lot of expectations that pediatrics participate in trials at a much higher level than the adult population. However, it has been my experience that pediatrics tends to run on treatment trials, their accrual tends to run in the 10 to 20% range. Many of the pediatric patients also are involved in other types of non-treatment interventional trials and non-interventional trials. So it's important to report all of the categories of accrual for pediatrics. But again, I don't think there's any hard and fast rule about the 10% for pediatrics. The most important thing is to show that your center is not excluding children from research. In fact, if your center is providing patient care services for children.
Thank you, Anita. And with that, we are all complete, no additional questions, and we'll conclude today's webinar. Please feel free to contact any of us if you have any questions. And thank you once again for joining the first of Huron's Cancer Center webinar series. As discussed today, we'll have several additional planned over the next coming months, and we hope to see you in subsequent webinars. Thanks again.